Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a relative newcomer to this campus, so my PowerPoint skills are not quite up to speed. So all I have is the spoken word. If you can imagine yourself in an ancient Roman Odeon with somebody standing up there with nothing but a toga on, and that was it. I suppose that's as close as we can come this morning. We have the most dramatic, ambitious title, I think, of the whole conference, The Meaning of Pain and Suffering. And we each get a 20-minute crack at this. So you can imagine the kind of confidence they've placed in us today. Okay? This is where we're going to solve it all. Not exactly. The challenge to make sense of suffering is always with us, but never more than when the end of life approaches. And we naturally turn to religion to assist us in this task. But religion does not offer a uniform answer to the question of suffering, and people do not always respond to their religious background in expected ways. If religion is a genuine resource to the sufferer and to those who assist them, we need to clarify its role, and we need to acknowledge its limitations. Although we often speak of the meaning of pain and suffering, it's not something that religion provides. The real concern of religion is not suffering, it's the sufferer. Pain and suffering have no meaning in themselves, but we can have meaning in and in spite of our sufferings. On 2 occasions, according to the Gospels, Jesus had the opportunity to explain why tragedy strikes. Why do some people suffer while others go free? And both times he turned the discussion another direction. The important thing, he said, in effect, is not the reason for suffering, but our response to suffering. Not why we suffer, but what we do when suffering comes. The experience of suffering presents us with a number of perplexing paradoxes. For most of human history, disease and death were part of everyday life. People faced the pain they brought, did their best to cope with it, and move on. Ironically, however, the more effective our attempts have become to resist disease and death, the more perplexing they seem to be. Now, thanks to medical science, people suffer much less in life than they would have in the past, and yet many people are more upset by it than ever before. The less we have to suffer, it seems, the more our suffering bothers us. Another paradox is the fact that suffering always seems to take us by surprise. Nothing is more obvious than the fact that everybody suffers, yet nothing seems more incomprehensible than my own suffering. As Kubler-Ross says of death, it comes to thee and to thee, but not to me. Or as the writer William Soroyan said, I knew that everybody died, but in my case I thought there'd be an exception. And the fact is, there are no exceptions, not even for nice people, not even for religious people. And this brings us to another paradox, the strikingly different effects that suffering has on religion. On one hand, philosophers and theologians regard it as the greatest challenge to religious belief. One philosopher maintains it's the only atheistic argument that deserves to be taken seriously. A theologian says that undeserved suffering is a greater obstacle to faith in God than all the theoretical and philosophical objections to God ever devised, all put together. It is the rock on which atheism rests. At the same time, suffering sometimes has a positive effect on religious belief. Many people find themselves drawing closer to God when they suffer than they were before. A young woman I know who spent several years as a hospice worker said that in her experience, nobody died an atheist. Everyone she knew came to terms with God at the end. Of course, the greatest paradox suffering presents us with is the apparent discrepancy between the power of God and the realities of life. If God is all-powerful, why does anyone suffer? An omnipotent being has the power to create any kind of world he wants and change anything in the world he wants to instantly. But if such a being existed, surely he would eliminate suffering or prevent it, or at least limit it. Now, historically, people have responded to this classical problem in 2 principal ways. One is to move suffering outside God's will, to maintain that God is not responsible for suffering. The most popular version of this approach appeals to free will. God endowed his creatures with the capacity to obey him or to disobey. They disobeyed, and the world now suffers the consequences. So it was human rebellion that ultimately accounts for the sorrows of the world. God did not cause it or will it. It was never God's plan that we suffer. The contrasting response to the problem of evil is to place suffering inside God's will. Things may appear to be out of control, goes this line of thought, but God is nevertheless completely in charge of his creation. And everything that happens has its place in his plan. We may not understand why God does things the way he does, but we can be sure that it is all for the best. Everything we go through, even the darkest chapters of our lives, is just what we need. God is using this painful process to develop our characters, to bring us to moral perfection. In time, we will see that God's will is perfect. Now, each of these responses generates a long list of questions. Some people can't understand how creatures who were perfect at the moment of creation could ever rebel against their Maker. Others wonder why an all-powerful Creator couldn't create beings who are free but always use their freedom to do the right thing. As for the other response, the idea that everything happens for the best seems contradicted by our everyday experience. The soul-making or character development God is bringing about doesn't seem very cost-efficient. Is it really necessary for us to suffer this much in order to learn the lessons we need to learn? History's horrendous evils hardly seem to justify whatever lessons we might learn from them, if indeed we've learned any. Consider the irony that in this last year of the 20th century, we face increased bloodshed in the Balkans, the very spot where an act of violence plunged the world into the first great war that scarred this century. Right back to where we started, it looks like. Now, there are responses to these questions and further questions about these responses and so on in an endless cycle of philosophical point-counterpoint. Now, I must admit that I enjoy such discussions. I think they serve an important purpose, but their value in addressing the meaning of suffering is limited. Each one gets us partway down the road, but none goes the distance and provides a satisfying solution to the problem of evil. And the obstacle that brings even the best of them to a halt is a concrete experience of human suffering. All the theories in the world can't stand up to the misery of a single sufferer. One of the most powerful expressions of this insight comes from Dostoevsky. In one passage in the Brothers Karamazov, the skeptical Ivan is challenging his brother, a tender soul who has become a novice monk. Imagine, says Ivan, that you are building the edifice of human destiny with the object of making people happy in the end and of giving them peace and rest at last. But for that, you must unavoidably torture just one tiny creature and raise the universe on the foundation of her unrequited tears. Would you agree to be the architect of a universe like that? Tell me the truth. After a long pause, Aloysius said quietly, "No, I would not agree, and neither would we." Theories founder on the shoals of human suffering. No explanation makes it intelligible. So what do we do when our theories sink in the sea of human tears? There are even times when religious beliefs seem to make suffering worse. I once heard two physicians agree that their religious patients seem to have a more difficult time coming to terms with a serious illness than their non-religious ones. The believers, they said, had all sorts of why me and why God questions that did not perplex the unbelievers. The unbelievers had fewer expectations, and so they were less inclined to feel that somehow they'd been let down. Well, something is obviously wrong when solutions turn out to be problems and our attempts to make things better wind up making them worse. When we're not getting good answers to our questions, the problem isn't always the answers. Sometimes it's the questions we're asking. Now, I'd like this morning to approach the problem of suffering as a personal, spiritual challenge rather than a theological or philosophical one. And to do so, I'll draw on the central story of my own faith community, the Christian Church. Like all great narratives, the gospel story reaches to people who stand outside as well as inside its circle. And so I hope you'll find it applicable to your situation, whatever your personal religious commitments may be. And if you belong to another faith community, I invite you to reflect on the great stories of your own tradition and consider ways they bear on the fundamental human problems that concern us at this conference. The cross and the resurrection of Jesus are central to the Christian story and indispensable to a Christian perspective on suffering. According to the Gospels, Jesus approached the cross with fear and apprehension. During the last night of his life, he asked his closest friends to watch with him, and he fervently prayed that God would spare him the bitter cup that lay ahead. His hopes notwithstanding, he endured the dark and loneliness of the cross, And his cry of desolation, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" reveals the depths of anguish to which he sank. With his resurrection, of course, Jesus broke the power of death, reversed the condemnation of the cross, and was reunited with his Father. The cross points to the inevitability of suffering in this world. Jesus did not avoid suffering, and neither can we. At the same time, Jesus' anguish confirms our basic intuition that suffering is wrong. There is a tragic abnormality to our existence. We know that we are susceptible to suffering and death, but we sense that we were not meant for them. They are intruders in our experience. The anguish of the cross also affirms Jesus' solidarity with us in our sufferings. It reminds us that we are never alone, no matter how dark and oppressive our situation may be. Because Jesus endured the cross, nothing can happen to us that he has not been through himself. Physical pain, separation from family and friends, the loss of worldly goods, the animosity of those he tried to help, even spiritual isolation, he knew it all. If the cross reminds us that suffering is unavoidable, the resurrection assures us that suffering never has the last word. Jesus could not avoid the cross, but he was not imprisoned by it. The empty tomb is the assurance that suffering is temporary. From the perspective of Christian hope, the time will come when suffering will be a thing of the past. It's important for us to see cross and resurrection together. Without the resurrection, the cross would be the last sad chapter in the story of a noble life. Jesus' death would simply demonstrate the well-known fact that the good often die young, with their dreams unfulfilled and their hopes dashed. The cross by itself would give evil the last word. It's only in light of the resurrection that we see the cross as a great victory, the central act in God's response to the problem of suffering. So the resurrection transforms our understanding of the cross. It turns tragedy into triumph. But conversely, the resurrection needs the cross. Standing alone, the resurrection seems to offer an easy escape from the rigors of this world. It would lead us to look for a detour around the difficulties of life. If God has the power to raise the dead, then surely he can insulate us from pain and sorrow. He can prevent us from suffering. But before the resurrection comes the cross. And this forces us to recognize that God often leads us through perils rather than around them. He does not promise to lift us dramatically and miraculously out of harm's way. Just as Jesus had his cross to bear, all his followers have theirs to bear as well. Jesus' promise to be with us in our sufferings also calls us to be with him in his sufferings. Now, this general view of things has several applications to the subject of palliative care. People who are suffering need to know, first of all, that suffering is real and suffering is wrong. Suffering involves the loss of good things. Our instinctive response to suffering is, oh no, there's something wrong. This is not what's supposed to happen to me. We should affirm that insight. We are not meant to suffer. We add insult to injury when we tell people that compared to what others have gone through, their situation is not too bad. Or when we tell them that this was supposed to happen for some inscrutable reason because they need it or somehow deserve it or will somehow benefit from it, or perhaps worst of all, as we heard a couple of people say yesterday, that someone is being punished through this experience. A recent motion picture recounts the life of the great cellist Jacqueline Dupre. Multiple sclerosis cut short her brilliant musical career and ended her life at the age of 42. The film ends with a fantasy where the adult Jackie meets the young Jackie on the beach and assures the child everything's going to be all right. I don't know how that struck you if you saw the movie, but I couldn't help feeling that it was an absurd and insipid insertion into the film. Instead of mitigating somehow the tragedy we had just seen, it trivialized the immensity of the loss. The fact is, everything isn't all right. Several years ago, a friend of ours learned she had ovarian cancer the very day her second child was born. As she struggled with the disease during the months that followed, well-wishers from her church assured her that God was testing her, or that God had chosen her for this special mission, or that God was getting ready to work a miracle on her behalf. All these approaches denied the reality and the magnitude of what she was facing, and needless to say, instead of easing her suffering, they compounded it. If there are any benefits that accompany suffering, they come not because suffering is good, but in spite of the fact that suffering is bad. The biblical book of Psalms, the longest book of the Bible, gives full expression to the depths of human woe. In fact, more than half of these ancient religious songs concern what one writer calls the wintry landscape of the heart. There is great comfort in these poems because suffering people need to know that their sufferings are acknowledged. Church historian Martin Marty describes losing his wife to cancer after nearly 30 years of marriage. During the months of her final hospitalization, they took turns reading a psalm at the time of her midnight medication. He read the even-numbered psalms, she read the odd-numbered psalms. And on this particular night, it was his turn. But it had been a wretched day of pain that racked her body and her soul, he writes. I did not feel up to reading a particularly somber psalm, so I passed over it. What happened to Psalm 88, she said. Why did you skip it? I didn't think you could take it tonight. I'm not sure I could. No, I'm sure I could not. Please read it for me, she said. All right. I cry out in the night before thee, for my soul is full of trouble. Thou hast put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. And so on. Thank you, she said when he was finished. I need that kind the most. After that conversation, we continued to speak, Marty recalls, slowly and quietly in the bleakness of the midnight, but in the warmth of each other's presence. We agreed that often the starkest scriptures were the most credible signals of God's presence and came at the worst time. When life gets down to basics, of course one wants the consoling words, the comforting sayings, the voices of hope preserved on printed pages, but they make sense only against the background of the dark words. Marty's experience affirms the right of people to face their suffering openly. People often need to know that their suffering is fully appreciated by their caregivers. In a book responding to the loss of his son, philosopher Nicholas Walterstorff describes his own struggle to own his grief, as he put it. The modern Western practice, he writes, is to disown one's grief, to get over it, to put it behind one, to get on with life, to put it out of mind, to ensure that it does not become part of one's identity. To see the point, we have only to think of the facile way in which newscasters talk of healing and closure just hours after some terrible tragedy has occurred. Well, it may be closure for them because the vans will pack up their equipment and move on in a couple of days, but it's not over for the people who've experienced this. My struggle, Walterstorff said, was to own my grief, to make it part of my identity. So if you want to know who I am, you must know that I am one whose son died. In a similar vein, Gerald Sitzer speaks of embracing the sorrow that engulfed him when he lost 3 members of his family in an automobile collision. To deal with the tragedy effectively, he found he could not go around his grief. He had to go through it. He had to penetrate its depths. Well, although it's important to acknowledge that suffering is real and suffering is wrong, it is equally important to insist that suffering does not have the last word. Suffering may be an inescapable part of our story, but it is not the whole story. We can be larger than our sufferings. People transcend their sufferings in several ways. One is courageously refusing to let suffering dominate them. This is one of the central points in Viktor Frankl's well-known book, Man's Search for Meaning. When every freedom is taken away, one freedom always remains, the freedom to choose our response. When we cannot change our situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And of course, the greater the challenge, the greater our courage must be. Frankl quotes Dostoevsky, "There is only one thing I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings." No matter how desperate a person's situation, they can surmount it by refusing to let it define their identity. We can be greater than our sufferings. This call to courage rests on the conviction that suffering does not diminish our value as human beings. And I think this is an important message that caregivers can provide. And it's especially important when we remember what our society relies on as a basis of personal worth. What do we care about, typically? We glorify the young, the athletic, the healthy, and the successful. In fact, we may honor productivity above all else. We identify people by what they do. Have you noticed whenever a newspaper mentions a person's name, it always follows it with an occupation? as if that gives us a clue to that person, that identifies him. We ask children what they want to be when they grow up. We describe older people in terms of what they used to be. We speak of them as retired school teachers, bus drivers, or dentists. It's as if children are not yet fully human and older persons are fully human no longer. One of the biggest concerns of people who are suffering from an illness or injury is the fear of losing their usefulness. My father-in-law underwent bypass surgery for the second time last summer. One of his post-operative complaints was the fear that he could no longer be useful, and if he couldn't be productive, life wasn't worth living. I like the way certain other cultures affirm all the stages of life, including the last ones. So no matter where you are, it's appropriate for you to be there. Hinduism, for example, sees 4 major stages of life. The first is the student stage, approximately ages 7 to 13. The second stage consists of marrying and setting up a household. It runs through most of adult life. The third stage is one of withdrawal. Here, people give more attention to religious matters. They move out of the household and devote themselves to spiritual pursuits. The fourth stage is not for everyone. It consists of renouncing the self that was before, giving up names, possessions, and even caste. But one stage is not glorified at the expense of others. Moving from one stage of life to another does not represent a loss of humanity. We also become larger than our sufferings when we realize that we do not suffer alone. God is with us in our sufferings. According to Christian faith, the story of Jesus is God's own story, and the great climax is the crucifixion. Some people believe that Christ suffered so we won't have to, but the cross represents solidarity as well as substitution. Christ not only suffers for us, he suffers with us. And from the perspective of Christian faith, this is a testimony to the fact that God is with us in our suffering, that everything that happens to us makes a difference to him. St. Paul's letter to the Romans contains the ringing assurance that nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ, not trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword, neither death nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation. Nothing can separate us from him. I used to believe that nothing can separate us from God because he's always waiting for us on the other side of the ordeal, and eventually we'll get there no matter how bad it is. But now I think it's a bit different. None of these things separates us from God, not because he's waiting for us after they are over, but because he is with us while they happen. In the words of the most famous passage in the Bible, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. This interpretation provides an interesting perspective on palliative care. It suggests that the role of the caregiver has profound spiritual significance. Its purpose is to manifest the presence of God to the sufferer, to offer the comfort and reassurance of one from whom our sufferings cannot separate us, one who is willing to enter into our experience and share it. The caregiver refuses to abandon someone to the isolation and emptiness of suffering alone. Suffering does not have the last word for those who have confidence for the future, so a final element in the Christian perspective on suffering is hope. One form of hope is the conviction that suffering counts for something, that it contributes to the achievement of some worthy goal. We have an instinctive desire to redeem tragedy by using it for some good purpose. Think of the good things that the families often do to respond to the loss of a child, for example. We've heard instances of that this week, this conference. A tragic loss seems to invite the response that we must do something to bring good out of this experience. These incidents must not lie there like gaping holes in the fabric of life. We must somehow mend them, learn from them, grow beyond them. And religious faith sustains this hope with the assurance that in everything God works for good. For many people, hope also takes the shape of a future beyond death, a realm of existence where suffering is a thing of the past. It is possible to claim too much here, and it is possible to claim it in the wrong way. Any assurance of life beyond must take into account your own faith stance and that of the patient. But Christianity offers the assurance of a love that is stronger than death, a love from which not even death can separate us. My uncle died of Parkinson's disease and was bedridden for the last 4 years of his life. My aunt cared for him day and night during that entire time, with the exception of a 1-hour visit each day from county caregivers. The other night, just a couple nights ago, I asked her the questions that form the title of our conference. What hurts? What works? One of the things she mentioned was the fact that his caregivers allowed him to contribute to them. In spite of his circumstances, his good nature, his faith, his sense of humor came through, and it made an impact on them. In fact, sometime after he died, one of the caregivers made a life-changing decision in part because of his influence during that time. What is the meaning of pain and suffering? Suffering has no meaning, but we can find meaning in, through, and in spite of suffering. And religious faith is an important resource for doing so. Thank you.
I heard Rick mention the phrase tragedy and triumph. He also made appeal to Psalm 88. And these are in my talk. So I figure he stole it from me. I remember one time telling my wife, I don't love you because I need you. I need you because I love you. And I was walking, I thought that was wonderful. And I was walking through the San Francisco airport and went by the gift shop, and I looked at some plaques along the wall. And I saw a plaque which said, I don't love you because I need you. I need you because I love you. And they didn't even ask me to use my sin. I will speak this afternoon on some personal reflections that I have gained from experiences with suffering, and then some biblical perspectives that may be helpful in considering this topic. In a now famous dictum, Scott Peck, in the opening line of his book, A Road Less Traveled, said, life is difficult. Without wishing to focus upon myself, but rather upon the reality of suffering itself, I can say that I have experienced a share of suffering. I do not want to say that I have experienced my fair share, because when it comes to suffering, can there ever be a fair share? I don't believe so. But my observations on this topic do come out of my personal experience, my encounters with others who've suffered, study on the topic, and looking at the Bible to see what it has to offer. The angle of faith. It is difficult to lose a father of a massive gangrene-producing heart attack and to watch him suffer excruciating pain and fast dwindling reserves of life for a period of 3 weeks. It is difficult to lose a wife to breast cancer, to watch her on a downward spiral toward death over a 1.5 year period. And it is difficult beyond measure to marry again, and in the first few days receive the unbelievable message that just as my new wife had lost her first husband to a massive heart attack less than 2 years before, she had now lost a beautiful 16-year-old daughter and a wonderful 19-year-old son in a tragic automobile accident just a little ways away from Grandma's house. Her only 2 children, a husband and 2 kids gone, wiped out. A Job-like reversal of fortune with more family than before could not make up for such a loss as this. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? These incidents do not even begin to measure the volume and intensity of happenings which bring on pain, suffering, and death. But they, along with encounters with others who suffer, and study of the whole issue, lead to the question, what can be learned from suffering? I offer just a few of my own personal observations. Hopefully they, plus the biblical perspectives, which we'll mention briefly, may be helpful in some way to you personally and to your work as health professionals. First of all, I would like to say there is no such thing as a quota of suffering, so that one could say, I or they have suffered enough, as if God says, as to Job, thus far and no farther. Job's no farther included everything he ever possessed and loved. And all that was left was his own wretched existence and a body headed straight to the grave. As for thus far, no farther, the agonizing question mounting up to the throne of God itself is, if no farther, why so far in the first place? I conclude that there really is no quota when it comes to suffering. The losses which my wife of the last 10 years endured were not hers alone, but those of her mother-in-law, who lost not only her son and his 2 children, but previous to that event, her daughter and her 2 children. Their lives were burned away in a fire. All this was succeeded by the suffering and death of her husband from Alzheimer's, the agony of which she witnessed over a long period of time. Then there was the woman I met at a camp meeting in Montana, who had lost 9 members of her family, her husband and 8 children, to disease, accidents, and murder. There is no limit. We have a mystery before us. But that mystery to which we are all connected can, if reflected upon and prayed about, lead us to more sensitivity and tenderness. Tenderness toward those who suffer before our very eyes. It can make us better health care givers. In the second place, I believe there is no respect of persons in terms of suffering. It comes to all alike, the righteous as well as the unrighteous. In view of this, we must surely avoid the too frequently held opinion involving both man and God, that those who suffer must have done something wrong, and God is punishing them for it. True, bad habits can lead to disease, but the factors which dispose to disease and hurt are so much broader than this. Much better to see in every person a child of God, and if that attitude be caught by the patient, a new peace and healing of the spirit, and perhaps even in some measure of the body, may result. Thirdly, it becomes clear also that notwithstanding there are sometimes negative consequences for human life, God does not suspend or destroy the laws governing the world, such as cause and effect, gravity, and so on, as well as such entities in the world as bacteria and parasites, which, like human beings, have both positive and negative potentialities. These all play a role in the drama of life. Without the laws of nature, for example, there would be no stability in the world, no possibility for science or for that research whereby disease might be studied, controlled, or cured, and pain eased. It is appropriate, therefore, to thank God for the good order of creation, even as we face what is painful and when there is no miracle. And that's what I speak of now. The previous observation about the continuance of basic laws and realities in the world is fundamental to what I say at this moment. Generally, there is no direct, miraculous intervention by God. Hospitals and clinics would be out of business if there were. God does not answer all of our prayers for healing as yes, despite biblical statements which may seem to affirm an almost ready-made yes. This raises the questions of how God's power is manifest in the world and whether the health professions constitute one of the main loci of God's saving activity. If God does not regularly work directly or miraculously, then does he work through processes and persons in the world, persons like all of you who are here today? I say yes. I teach a course to first-year medical students called Medicine, Humanity, and God. And I point out to the students, I write it on the board, this title, Medicine, Humanity, and God. And I point out to the students that humanity is the middle term. And then I draw a little arched arrow over from medicine to humanity, showing medicine's interest in the healing of humanity. And then I draw a little arrow from God to humanity, showing that God likewise is interested in the healing of humanity. And then I draw a long arrow from medicine to God, suggesting that medicine and God, healthcare and God, are partners in the work of healing in the world. And I believe it is of the greatest significance that health professionals see themselves in this partnership with God. This cannot help but affect the personal and spiritual quality of the health care they give, especially in a patient's last days. A sense of God's loving presence, mediated through a healthcare person who knows that she or he is in the employ of God, the God of redemptive love, is just what the patient needs, I believe. In the book and film, Dead Man Walking, the Catholic nun says to the about-to-be executed prisoner, whom she has visited many times, she says, "The last face I want you to see is the face of love." In this case, her face. May the last face your patients see be also the face of love, your face, which at the same time will be the face of God. As we think further, just as the laws of nature are not suspended, so also the freely willed decisions of people are not obstructed. God is so interested that people freely embrace the good that he is the guarantor of freedom, even when freedom may be misused. People may make choices which are contrary to current and available health knowledge, and may refuse both medical advice and treatment. As God respects human freedom, so should healthcare professionals. The freedom and dignity of choice of one in the end of days should be honored and appealed to whenever that is possible. As God does not block people from making poor choices, so he does not prevent healthcare professionals from making mistakes. Though my first wife had a very strong family history of breast cancer, her gynecologist, a very genial and good man, did not give her a mammogram for a period of 8 years, and only exceeded in doing so when there was a discharge from one breast, and he did this largely to calm us down. I can still hear his words. "I don't think there's a serious problem here, but if it will make you feel better, let's do a mammogram." When calcium deposits were reported in the breast, he once again gave us assurances that this probably was not something to worry about, but as before, he wanted to make us feel better, and so he would now send us to a surgeon for a biopsy. The rest of the story is history, with a fatal ending. God does not prevent these mistakes as a matter of course, but an attitude of humble dependence upon God and constant prayer for his guidance and insight, along, of course, with continued study and consultation with other professionals in the community of God's caregivers, might minimize some of these mistakes. Now, turning to a different kind of observation, I have found it to be true that spiritual resources gained before suffering are what sustain a person through suffering. Suffering needs to be prepared for. When the realities of suffering and loss hit, it seems that one has no resources left at all. You just don't seem to have anything to cope with it. But if one has been developing a connection with God and a sense of his presence and love, these will operate through the darkness to bring one's spirit through. The health professional's attitude of love and appeal to the spiritual will only enhance these resources. But if these resources have not been developed, the health professional's faith, hope, and love can stimulate a kind of thief on the cross experience. The thief, truly seeing Jesus and his goodness for the first time at the last moment of his life, becomes the receptor of a sustaining promise of love and life. You shall be with me in paradise. And I believe your patients can receive that promise from you in the end of their days. All of this means, therefore, that human support and identification with suffering people is absolutely crucial. Though sufferers need spiritual resources from God in heaven, they need God's people on earth to identify with their pain, suffering, and fear. They need, among others, and especially so, a healthcare professional who is willing to suffer with them. Interestingly, the word compassion means feeling with, and hence suffering with. It is the ultimate form of empathy. It is incarnation, and its model is Jesus. There is a curious statement about us and Jesus in Paul's epistle to the Romans, chapter 8, verse 17. Paul says that since we are God's children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we also may be glorified with him. In order to be a part of the glorified world, this text says, the world which is coming, we are called to suffer with Jesus in this world. What does this mean? My reflections lead me to this point of view. We can suffer from the hurtful things of this life, the slings of outrageous fortune. But according to Paul, it is not what we suffer from, but who we suffer with that qualifies us for a part in God's new world. Suffering with Jesus is what makes this possible. To suffer with Jesus, I suggest, is not only to identify with his personal suffering so that we say, look at how Jesus suffered, how great his pain was. Rather, it is to identify with Jesus' cause and enterprise. What he suffered for, that's what we need to be into. Who can fail to be moved by the portrait of the suffering servant of God in Isaiah 53, a depiction which the New Testament Christians applied to Jesus? In essence, and actually quoting a verse, what Isaiah 53 says is, he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. To suffer with Jesus is to suffer with those who suffer. To suffer with Jesus is to have our cheeks wet with the tears of those who cry out in pain, loss, and the frightening prospect of the future. We come so close to them that we bear their griefs and carry their sorrows. What a privilege to do so. I learned something about identification when my first wife died. I wished to spend time with her in the hospital room where she lay. The surgeon who had operated on her took me to the place. I expected to be alone, but when I walked into the room, the surgeon walked in with me. When I moved to one end of her bed, he moved to the other. When I drew closer, he did also. When I bent down, he bent down. He was my alter ego. He had worked so hard with her just before she died to dislodge a clot in her pulmonary artery. Now he worked to identify with me. He suffered with Jesus by suffering with me. In identifying with a person whose time is short, we help to ease their emotional pain, and we help to make them ready for what is to come. Ready not merely for death, but ready to meet the author of life. Some years ago in Angwin, California, up north here, Dr. Louis Venden, my dear friend of a long time, and I were summoned to anoint a physician who had suffered for over 20 years from the cancer in her jaw and face, and from all the unsuccessful surgeries to halt its growth. The most recent surgery, at first thought to have finally done the trick, also proved to be futile. Now, in harmony with Scripture, she called us for an anointing. I feared the event, for if our prayers and touching her with oil did not bear the fruit of healing, she might despair, I thought, and grow weak in faith. I was worried about that. What she said when we arrived, however, healed me. What she wanted from us was to gain assurance that she was ready to meet God. This is what your patients in the final time need as well. In a few days, I will visit a man who recently learned that he had Lou Gehrig's disease and that it was moving swiftly. He's a brilliant fellow, and he would have a brilliant future ahead. But he called me to come, not for an anointing in this case, but to help him to avoid bitterness against life and against God. What a privilege to be in a place where my friend will expose his wounds to me. I may well be unable to keep from crying with him, my former student, but perhaps suffering with him will bring him some peace and will soften his just resentment. I certainly hope so, and all of us are called to this kind of identification, this kind of ministry. I can still hear the shout of Dr. Bittron, the Jewish doctor at Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago, who, when he heard that my wife, who had just had a surgery, her last surgery, last of many surgeries, that she had cancer of the lung. And on the other side of the phone, I heard him shout, "No!" And that no really meant something to me. I had shouted it myself, but to hear his no, even though there didn't look to be much hope in this case, really brought a redemptive feeling to me. We need to shout with those who suffer. We need to pray with those who suffer. We need to be with those who suffer and suffer with Jesus in their presence. Finally, my reflections on suffering lead me to the conclusion that God is not the cause of our suffering, but that He may use suffering for good. My father, years ago in Yugoslavia, went back to Yugoslavia to visit his homeland once again, and he had an incredible heart attack in that place. And I was able to get there in time and to spend some 10 days with him. And one could think that this was a useless event, his death and his suffering, that no good could come from it. In fact, I was in the intensive care unit and one evening, and I was reading a book, and the nurse was in there reading a book as well. I said to her, "What are you reading?" She said, "I'm reading a novel." I says, "Is it good?" She said, "Yes, it's very good." She said, "What are you reading?" And so I had some heavy tome, big, thick, complicated tome on justification by faith, and I didn't know how to say what this book was. I said, "Well, I'm reading a book on the goodness of God." And she said, "God is not good. I am good." And what she meant was quite clear. Here I am doing all that I can for all of these people who are critically ill. But what is God doing? It was a just reflection on her part. But before I came to Yugoslavia, God was doing something. And people, Christians of my own faith, a faith that my father resented and resented in me, unbeknownst to me, were ministering to my father. they would come to him and visit him. A husband and wife brought him food to eat which he couldn't eat, drink which he could drink a little of. And they touched him, and they lifted him up, and they put him down, and they turned him over. And they talked to him about God's love. And when I got there, one of the earliest things that God said to me, not God, but my Father, was, if they make people like this, then I want to be a part of this people. And if I live to get out of this hospital, then I want to be baptized into this people. My father was moved by the love of those Christian people in Yugoslavia, and he gave his heart to God, and he died in the peace of a new relationship to God. God may not save us from suffering, but he does work in our suffering often to bring good. Just looking briefly now at some biblical perspectives, may I first refer you to God and Job, the book of Job. A book which is a protest against a too facile understanding of suffering. The usual theory was that good brings good and bad brings bad. Job says, no, it's much more complicated than that. You may be good and receive the bad. You may be bad and receive things that are good. There is injustice and there is unfairness in this world. And as we look at this book for a solution to the problem of suffering, a book that I moved toward when my wife's children were killed, I hoped that I would find an answer here. I find that the answer to suffering is not found in the first two prose chapters, the prologue, where Satan afflicts Job and his family under, mind you, the authority of God in the first two chapters. I do not believe that's the answer. Satan is the answer to the problem of suffering. Nor do I believe that the answer is to be found in the prose epilogue of the book, where Job receives a larger family than before and greater fortune than before. But I think that the answer is found in the poetry of the book. And in that poetry, we find that the Job who was so magnanimous toward God in the first two chapters begins to say things that don't seem to be completely in harmony with that magnanimity. He wishes that he could die. That's one of the things he says in a number of places. He wonders why the wicked prosper, and he wonders especially why the innocent, like himself, suffer. What does he want? He wants a trial with God, because he's assured that if he can get in God's courtroom, he can prove his case. In any case, he believes that God is the cause of his suffering, that God is the adversary. Finally, he meets up with God. God grants him a hearing. And God, instead of answering directly why he is suffering, takes him on a tour of the universe, the physical universe, and then the animal kingdom on earth. And you wonder how a man crying out for justice could find any kind of peace or answer in a consideration of these kinds of realities. But Job comes to see that he is measuring God on a small scale, the scale of his mind. And when he gets a vision of God and his greatness, he gets a vision of his true place in the world. And he will no longer try to break the line that divides between Almighty God and temporary humankind. And he repents in dust, cloth, in ashes. He repents. That is to say, he has gained now a new attitude toward God. And I believe that what the book is calling us to is to place the hand of faith in the hand of the God of supreme wisdom and power. That this really is the message of Job, and to trust in this God. Is this enough? I don't think so, but this is very helpful. We turn to God in Jesus. And what we see in Jesus is not merely God's power, but God's vulnerability. And we need this. Jesus says from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And although Rabbi Kushner in his wonderful book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, says we shouldn't ask the question why, we need to ask, what shall I do now in the midst of these troubles, or for people who are troubled? I believe that the question why is very important. It's a question about God. Where are you, God, when I need you? And Jesus himself raises the question, why, God, have you left me alone at this time? Why are you so suffering? He has a question. But that isn't all he has. From the cross, he makes another utterance. He says, into your hands I commend my spirit. Not only a question, but an affirmation of faith. And I believe, until the end of time, we all will have these two realities within us. I think we'll have a question why all this is happening. But I hope and pray, too, we will have an affirmation of faith that will place all of our trust in God. In Jesus, we see a cross, as Rick has pointed out. It seems a very tragic event. It is. But then comes the resurrection, which is not merely a promise that life can be after suffering and death, but is a promise that suffering for others is the final redemptive truth. That Jesus rises, authenticates a message that joining with others in their suffering in order to bring them healing is really what we are all about. This is the essence of life. Ellen White has said, Adventists have found much value in her, that the law of life, that self-giving love is the law of life for the universe. And I believe that to be true. Then there is God in present suffering, and I must hurry, I can see this, or you will begin to suffer very quickly here. It is interesting for me to know, and for you to note, that the Bible says that God is afflicted with us. In a wonderful text in Isaiah 63:9, it says, in all their affliction, he was afflicted. And in Romans, the 8th chapter, we hear in verse 26 of the Spirit that groans with us. There's one word that predominates in Romans 8. It is the word groaning. The world groans, and we groan in our pain. And even God's Spirit groans, indicating that God is one with us in our suffering. In the book of Hebrews, it says that Jesus is touched by the feeling of our infirmities. God feels what we feel and suffers with us. Where was God at Auschwitz? He was with those who were being led to the slaughter. He was crying at the side of those who were suffering. And then not only that, but God promises that he will carry us through. Again in Isaiah 40. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hid from the Lord. My right is disregarded by my God. But have you not known, have you not heard, the Lord is the everlasting God. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint. And to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. And again, God says, when you think, that you've been forgotten, Isaiah 49, the Lord has forsaken me. That's the cry of Israel. My Lord has forgotten me. And God replies, can a woman forget her sucking child, that she should have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. Behold, I have engraven you on the palms of my hands. I hope you can indicate to all your patients that God has not forgotten them, and that when they're at the resources of their end of the resources of strength, that God will give them the courage and the ability to go on. And then, too, God does hear our prayers. We could spend time on this. Romans 8:26 and 7 says that the Spirit groans with us. He takes our prayers to God. And our own characters can be strengthened through suffering. Now I got just 2 points. See, I'm coming to the end. I'm going to mention them. I see the spirits of those who are telling me things. God in the future. There is a new future, according to Scripture. You shall be with me in paradise, is what Jesus says to all those who suffer and who call upon him. And then one last thing, which I think perhaps is the most important of all. At the end of 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, right now we see in a glass darkly. Life is an enigma. It is a puzzle and we don't understand. But one day we're going to see face to face. The curtain is going to be turned away, and we're going to see ultimate reality as it really is. And then we shall know God, as he now presently knows all about us and our sufferings and so on. But until that day comes, what remains? From the now of suffering to the then of God's perfect revelation of himself, what remains? Paul says faith, hope, and love remain, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Your love for your patients is the final truth, and it's what bridges the gap between the now and the then. My last sentence is, there is no explanation to suffering. There is only love. God's love coming to us and God's love flowing through us. And I pray that you'll feel that love and that you will spread that love.